It took exactly 7 seconds for Senator John Kennedy to realize the trap had been sprung, not by him, but on him, a perfectly executed counterambush that threatened to unravel 2 years of meticulous planning. The senator's insistence on focusing on the cost of saving the planet, rather than the cost of losing it, is precisely the kind of short-sighted, fossil fuel-beholden thinking that history will judge as criminal negligence, she said, her voice a clear, ringing bell of moral certainty, amplified by the microphone to fill the cavernous hearing room. 7 seconds. That's all it took. 7 seconds of absolute, unblinking confidence, 7 seconds of a perfectly memorized, focus-grouped, and politically weaponized soundbite, delivered with the practiced ease of a seasoned revolutionary. She never saw the flicker in his eye, the almost imperceptible tightening of the jaw beneath the loose, comfortable skin of his face, never realized that the folksy Southern lawyer with the reading glasses and the comically oversized accordion file was about to pivot from defense to a scorched-earth offense she couldn't possibly have prepared for. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me set the scene, because the context of this betrayal makes the coming destruction so much more profound. It was the final day of the Joint Congressional Committee on Climate and Economic Transition, a hearing designed not to legislate, but to grandstand. The air in the Dirksen Senate office building hearing room was thick, not just with the humid Washington summer, but with the cloying scent of ambition and the metallic tang of fear. C-SPAN had 3 cameras trained on the witness table, knowing that this final confrontation between the firebrand Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the master rhetorician Senator John Kennedy was the main event. She sat alone at the witness table, a solitary figure in a crisp, white suit that seemed to absorb and reflect the harsh overhead fluorescent lights, a deliberate visual contrast to the dark, mahogany paneling and the somber, gray suits of the committee members. Her expression was one of practiced, weary patience, the look of a prophet forced to explain simple truths to stubborn, earthbound men. Kennedy sat at the center of the dais, his posture slightly slumped, his tie loosened just enough to suggest a man of the people, not a Harvard law graduate. His bifocals were perched low, allowing him to peer over the top at the Congresswoman, a gesture that made him look simultaneously professorial and deeply skeptical. His accordion file, a beige, expanding monstrosity, sat beside him, overflowing with documents, a physical manifestation of the bureaucratic weight he was about to drop on her. He had spent the last hour methodically dismantling the financial projections of her signature legislation, the Green New Deal, focusing on the astronomical $93 trillion price tag. He had been slow, deliberate, and almost boring, a strategy designed to lull her into a false sense of security, to make her believe he was simply another easily dismissed, number-crunching conservative. And then she had taken the bait. He had just finished a long, meandering question about the actuarial risk of nationalizing the energy grid, a question so dense with financial jargon that half the reporters in the room had stopped typing. She had leaned into her microphone, her eyes bright with contempt, and delivered her pre-written retort, the one designed to go viral, the one that dismissed his entire argument as a moral failing. The senator's insistence on focusing on the cost of saving the planet rather than the cost of losing it is precisely the kind of short-sighted, fossil fuel-beholden thinking that history will judge as criminal negligence. She repeated, the final words hanging in the air, a challenge, a judgment, a political execution. Kennedy slowly removed his reading glasses. The movement was agonizingly slow, a deliberate theatrical pause that seemed to stretch the fabric of time in the room. He placed them on the desk, not with a clatter, but with a soft, almost reverent thud against the polished wood. He didn't smile. Not yet. His face was utterly blank, a mask of deep, wounded contemplation. She thinks she's won the moral argument, Kennedy thought, the internal monologue a low, rumbling growl in his mind. She thinks I'm just a talking head for big oil, a simpleton who can be shamed into silence. She doesn't understand that the moral argument is the easiest one to win because it's the easiest one to fake. The numbers, Congresswoman, the cold, hard, unforgiving numbers are where the truth hides, and I have found the truth in your numbers. A very ugly truth. He let the silence deepen. 10 seconds. 15. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic whir of the C-SPAN cameras and the nervous rustle of papers from the committee staff. Ocasio-Cortez, initially triumphant, began to feel the weight of the silence. Her hands, which had been resting confidently on the table, now subtly shifted, her fingers interlocking, a tiny, unconscious gesture of defense. Why isn't he speaking? She wondered, her internal voice a sudden, sharp spike of anxiety. He's supposed to interrupt, to sputter, to demand a retraction. This silence, it's not his style. It's too controlled. He's planning something. He's always planning something. She forced herself to maintain eye contact, her gaze steady, but a cold knot of dread began to form in her stomach. She had prepared for the policy debate, the financial critique, the ideological clash. She had not prepared for the silence of a predator who had just realized his prey was cornered. Finally, Kennedy leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, his hands clasped loosely. His voice, when it came, was no longer the slow, folksy drawl of the policy wonk. It was lower, richer, and carried a dangerous, almost hypnotic resonance. "Congresswoman," he began, the single word a velvet hammer. That was a powerful statement, truly. Criminal negligence. Strong words. Words that suggest a profound moral clarity, and I respect that. I truly do. Because if we are going to talk about moral clarity, if we are going to talk about history's judgment, then we must, absolutely must, talk about betrayal. He paused, his eyes, now unshielded by the glasses, boring into hers. "You see, Congresswoman, I have spent the last 2 years studying your Green New Deal. Not the rhetoric, not the bumper stickers, but the actual 2,000-page legislative text. And I have to tell you, I found something in there. Something buried so deep, so cleverly disguised by layers of progressive language and environmental mandates, that it took a team of forensic accountants and legislative analysts 6 months to unearth it. It is a provision so cynical, so utterly devoid of the moral clarity you preach, that it doesn't just represent short-sighted thinking. It represents a calculated, multi-billion-dollar betrayal of the very people you claim to represent." He reached for his accordion file, pulling out a single, thick, red-tabbed document. He held it up, not to the camera, but to her. "We have spent this entire hearing debating the $93 trillion cost, but we have neglected to discuss who, precisely, is going to get the first, most lucrative slice of that pie. Who is the hero of this $93 trillion story? Who is the one corporation that stands to gain a monopoly on the entire American energy transition, thanks to a single, obscure, 14-line provision on page 1487 of your bill?" Ocasio-Cortez felt a sudden, dizzying rush of heat to her face. Page 1487. The Certified Carbon Capture Infrastructure Mandate. She hadn't written it. It had been slipped in during the final, frantic negotiations with the Senate leadership, a concession she had been told was necessary to secure the vote of a key centrist. She had skimmed it, seeing only the words carbon capture and infrastructure, and had signed off, exhausted and pressured. Now the name of the company flashed in her mind: Ethereum Energy Solutions. No, he can't know about Ethereum. That was a private negotiation. It was sealed. It was just a technical provision. It was necessary. It was a compromise for the greater good. Her internal defense mechanisms kicked in, a frantic, desperate scramble for justification. The bill saves the planet. A few $1 billion to one company is a small price for global survival. Kennedy is just trying to muddy the waters, to distract from the climate crisis. Kennedy watched the subtle shift in her expression, the momentary widening of the eyes, the slight compression of the lips, and knew he had hit the nerve. He didn't need her to confess. Her fear was the confession. "The provision, Congresswoman, is a masterpiece of legislative obfuscation," Kennedy continued, his voice now a low, conspiratorial murmur, as if sharing a secret with the entire nation. "It mandates that all new, federally funded energy infrastructure must utilize a proprietary, next-generation, closed-loop carbon sequestration system that is certified by a single, non-governmental, international consortium. A consortium, I might add, that was founded and is currently chaired by the former CEO of Ethereum Energy Solutions." He laid the document flat on the desk, smoothing it with the palm of his hand. "Ethereum Energy Solutions, Congresswoman. a company that until 3 years ago was a failing regional natural gas distributor, a company that today, thanks to this single, non-negotiable mandate in your bill, is now the sole, legally protected provider of the technology required to implement the Green New Deal, a $93 trillion monopoly handed to a single, politically connected entity. That, Congresswoman, is not economic justice. That is not saving the planet. That is the single largest corporate handout in the history of the Republic. He leaned back, the picture of a man deeply, personally offended. And here is where the betrayal truly stings. Ethereum Energy Solutions, whose stock has skyrocketed 1,200% since this bill was introduced, is not some scrappy startup. It is a company whose primary investors include a Saudi sovereign wealth fund, a Russian oligarch with known ties to the Kremlin, and most recently, a massive, anonymous investment from a Delaware-based shell corporation that just happens to share a legal address with the largest donor to your own political action committee. The room was no longer just silent, it was breathless. The reporters who had been half-dozing through the financial minutiae were now typing furiously, the click-clack of their keyboards a sudden, violent percussion. Ocasio-Cortez felt the blood drain from her face. The Shell Corporation, the donor, she knew the donor, a billionaire hedge fund manager who had suddenly become a passionate environmentalist, funding her PAC with millions, demanding only one thing in return: a technical review of the carbon capture language. She had dismissed the request as harmless, a wealthy man wanting to feel important. Now she saw the full, horrifying architecture of the deal. She hadn't just compromised. She had been used as a pawn in a game of global, high-stakes corporate plunder. I swear I didn't know the extent of it. I thought it was just a small concession, a necessary evil. I was focused on the big picture, the millions of jobs, the end of fossil fuels. I was too tired. I trusted the staff. I trusted the process. The internal monologue was a desperate, panicked scream, a frantic attempt to build a wall of plausible deniability around her crumbling conviction. I was not aware of the full scope of Ethereum's ownership structure, she stammered, her voice thin, a stark contrast to her earlier ringing pronouncements. The provision was vetted by the committee's legal counsel. It was a necessary technical requirement to ensure the efficacy of the carbon capture mandate. The focus on a single company is a distraction from the existential threat of climate change. Kennedy smiled now. It was a slow, cold, triumphant smile that didn't reach his eyes. A distraction. Congresswoman, when $93 trillion of taxpayer money is about to be funneled into the pockets of a company owned by Russian oligarchs and Saudi princes, that is not a distraction. That is the central, defining feature of your legislation. You have taken the moral urgency of the climate crisis and used it as a smokescreen to execute a massive, global wealth transfer to the very elites you claim to despise. He picked up a second document, this one a printout of a recent social media post from her official account. And here is the final, crushing irony. Just last week, you posted this. We must dismantle the systems of corporate greed that prioritize profit over people and planet. Yet, your signature bill creates a new, federally mandated, $93 trillion corporate monopoly. You are not dismantling the system, Congresswoman. You are simply installing a new, more politically compliant landlord. He leaned forward, his voice dropping back to that dangerous, resonant whisper. Tell me, Congresswoman, when you signed off on page 1487, did you feel the weight of that betrayal? Did you hear the silent laughter of the oligarchs who bought your moral high ground for the price of a few campaign donations? Did you, for 1 second, think about the working-class families who will be paying for this $93 trillion bill, only to see the profits flow to the very people you call the rich? He paused, letting the full, toxic weight of the accusation settle. He then turned his head, looking directly into the C-SPAN camera, his eyes piercing the lens, addressing the millions watching at home. If you believe that politicians who preach purity while practicing the most cynical form of corporate cronyism should be held accountable, if you want to see the rest of the evidence that exposes this $93 trillion betrayal, then you need to hit that like button and subscribe right now. Because what comes next is the financial paper trail that leads directly to the Congresswoman's inner circle, and it is far uglier than you can imagine. He turned back to Ocasio-Cortez, his face hardening. Now, let's talk about the delivery mechanism of this betrayal. Let's talk about the Green Jobs Provision, Title III, Section 4, which you championed as the heart of the bill. The provision that guarantees a living wage and union representation for every worker in the new energy sector. A beautiful, progressive promise. But a promise, Congresswoman, that is structurally designed to fail, leaving millions of newly trained workers stranded and indebted. He pulled out a series of internal memos from the Department of Labor and the Congressional Budget Office, documents that had been classified as sensitive until Kennedy's committee subpoenaed them. These memos, Congresswoman, detail the CBO's analysis of the Green Jobs Training and Certification Act, which is the enabling legislation for Title III. The CBO found that the training programs, which are mandatory for employment in the Ethereum-mandated infrastructure projects, are structured as private, for-profit vocational schools. He read from a highlighted section of a CBO memo. The mandated certification programs, while federally subsidized, require a minimum upfront tuition payment of $15,000 per student, with the federal subsidy only being disbursed upon successful completion and placement. The average completion rate for the initial pilot programs was 12%, leaving 88% of participants with a $15,000 debt and no job placement. Ocasio-Cortez felt a fresh wave of nausea. She remembered the debate over the training programs. The union leaders had insisted on the certification requirement to ensure quality. The progressive think tanks had pushed for the private-public partnership model to ensure speed. She had seen the $15,000 figure, but had been assured it was a loan that would be immediately forgiven upon employment. The 12% completion rate was a figure she had never seen. It had been buried in a footnote of a preliminary report, dismissed by her staff as an outlier from a poorly managed pilot. The jobs were the promise. The jobs were the reason I fought for this. I sold this bill on the promise of millions of good union jobs, and now it's a debt trap, a funnel for student loan companies. I didn't just sell out to the oligarchs, I sold out the workers. The realization was a physical blow, a sudden sharp pain behind her eyes. Her carefully constructed moral fortress was collapsing, brick by brick, under the relentless surgical assault of Kennedy's facts. You see, Congresswoman, Kennedy continued, his voice now tinged with genuine, cold anger. You didn't just create a corporate monopoly for your donors. You created a debt-for-training scheme for your constituents. You promised them a ladder out of poverty, and you handed them a $15,000 bill and a certificate for a job that doesn't exist. The only people guaranteed a profit from the Green Jobs program are the private vocational schools, which, coincidentally, are largely owned by the same holding company that controls a significant portion of Ethereum Energy Solutions. He slammed his hand lightly on the desk. The sound was disproportionately loud in the silent room. This is not just hypocrisy, Congresswoman. This is a systemic, multi-layered betrayal. You use the language of the revolution to justify the most predatory form of capitalism. You are the perfect synthesis of corporate greed and political virtue signaling. You are the face of the new aristocracy, one that doesn't hide its wealth but cloaks it in the flag of environmental righteousness. He pulled out a large, glossy photograph, a printout from a high-resolution satellite image. He had it displayed on the large screen behind him, replacing the CBO chart. It was an image of a vast, sprawling complex under construction in a remote, arid region of the country. This, Congresswoman, is the future you have built. This is the flagship green energy hub mandated by your bill. A $12 billion facility, built on land acquired through eminent domain, displacing hundreds of small ranchers and farmers who were told their land was needed for the greater good. This facility, which will house the first of Ethereum's proprietary carbon capture systems, is located in a region with zero existing renewable energy infrastructure. It is hundreds of miles from any major population center. The energy required to run the carbon capture system, a system designed to reduce carbon, will be generated by a brand new, federally subsidized natural gas power plant. He let the words sink in. Natural gas power plant, the ultimate unforgivable sin in her political lexicon. You read that correctly, folks, Kennedy said, addressing the camera again, his voice heavy with disbelief. The Green New Deal's flagship carbon capture facility, the one that justifies the $93 trillion expenditure, is powered by a brand new taxpayer-funded fossil fuel plant. Why? Because Ethereum's proprietary system is so energy-intensive, so inefficient that it requires a dedicated, massive, and reliable power source. And the only reliable power source available in that remote location is natural gas, the very thing you promised to eliminate within 10 years. Ocasio-Cortez felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. The natural gas plant. She had been told it was a temporary bridge fuel solution until the solar and wind farms could be built. She had been assured the emissions would be fully offset by the carbon capture. But the image on the screen was undeniable. A massive, gleaming new fossil fuel plant, a monument to the very industry she had sworn to destroy. Bridge, a temporary measure, that's what they told me. But a $12 billion facility is not a bridge. It's a permanent structure. It's a lie. I built a lie. Her internal monologue was a torrent of self-recrimination, a desperate attempt to find the point of no return the moment she had lost control of her own legislation. It was the Senate. They corrupted it. They poisoned the well. But I was the one who drank the water. I was the one who sold the vision, knowing the details were murky. I was so focused on the victory, I didn't see the defeat hidden inside the trophy. Kennedy watched her struggle, the silent, internal war playing out on her face. He knew he had won. The policy was irrelevant now. The debate was over. He had exposed the core of her political being as a fraud. But let's talk about the people who paid the real price for this temporary bridge fuel, Kennedy said, his voice softening, adopting the tone of a sympathetic prosecutor. The ranchers and farmers who lost their land. The people who were told they were standing in the way of progress. I have here a deposition from a Mrs. Clara Jenkins, a 78-year-old woman whose family had worked their cattle ranch for 4 generations. She was given 30 days to vacate. Her compensation was $1.2 million, a fraction of the land's true value, and a pittance compared to the $12 billion facility now sitting on her ancestral home. He pulled out a small, framed photograph, a simple, faded image of an elderly couple standing in front of a modest farmhouse. He held it up, a stark contrast to the glossy satellite image on the screen. Mrs. Jenkins, in her deposition, said she tried to contact your office, Congresswoman. She wrote letters. She called. She even flew to Washington, D.C. and waited outside your office for 3 days. She was told you were too busy saving the planet to meet with a single, displaced rancher. She was told her sacrifice was necessary for the greater good. Kennedy's voice cracked with manufactured emotion. The greater good, Congresswoman. The greater good for Ethereum Energy Solutions. The greater good for the Russian oligarchs and the Saudi princes. You displaced an American family, destroyed their legacy, and built a natural gas plant on their grave, all in the name of a Green New Deal that is nothing more than a corporate shell game. He leaned back, the performance complete. The folksy lawyer was gone, replaced by the righteous avenger. Your entire political brand, Congresswoman, is built on the idea of fighting for the marginalized, for the working class, for the people who are ignored by the powerful. Yet, when the moment came to protect them, you were too busy negotiating with the powerful, too busy signing off on the fine print, too busy celebrating your victory to notice the people you were crushing underfoot. He picked up the red-tabbed document again, the one detailing the Ethereum mandate. This document, Congresswoman, is not just a piece of legislation. It is a contract between you and the forces of corporate greed. And the price of that contract was your soul and the livelihoods of millions of Americans who believed your rhetoric. Ocasio-Cortez finally found her voice, a raw, desperate sound. No, I did not. I was unaware of the existence of Chen Ray's Consulting, LLC, and I was unaware of any payments from Vanguard Strategies. This is a betrayal of my trust and a gross violation of the public trust. I demand an immediate investigation." Kennedy nodded slowly, a gesture of weary agreement. "An investigation is certainly warranted, Congresswoman, but let us not pretend this is a simple matter of a rogue staffer. This is a systemic failure of leadership. You created a political environment where the rhetoric of revolution was so loud, so intoxicating, that it drowned out the quiet, grinding sound of corruption happening right under your nose. You were so busy fighting the system that you failed to notice the system was using your own people to fleece the American taxpayer." He pulled out the final document, a single sheet of paper. "And here is the final, most damning piece of evidence, Congresswoman. This is a copy of the lease agreement for the luxury apartment you currently reside in, the one in the Navy Yard neighborhood, the one with the $4,800 a month rent that is double the average rent in your district. The lease is held not by you, but by Chen Ray's Consulting, LLC. Your chief of staff and your former campaign manager were paying your rent, Congresswoman, while they were simultaneously taking $4 million from the corporate entity that benefited most from your legislation." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a political career ending, not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating realization of a life built on a foundation of lies. Ocasio-Cortez stared at the document, the address of her own home, a final, undeniable piece of evidence of her complicity. She had been living in a gilded cage, paid for by the very corporate interests she claimed to despise, all while her staff profited from the destruction of her own political vision. The betrayal was complete. The revolutionary was exposed as a puppet, her strings pulled by the very forces she had sworn to fight. The final, crushing irony was that she had been living the life of the aristocracy, not by choice, but by the calculated, cynical design of her own trusted inner circle. Kennedy closed his accordion file with a soft, definitive snap. "I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman." The education was over. The lesson was learned. The cost of moral arrogance was absolute political destruction. The only thing left was the reckoning. The final, long, agonizing silence of a political career collapsing under the weight of its own hypocrisy. The betrayal was complete, and the silence of the room was the sound of history's judgment. The chairman, his face a mask of discomfort, cleared his throat. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, do you have any final statement before we adjourn?" Ocasio-Cortez did not move. She felt the blood pounding in her ears, a frantic, rhythmic drumbeat that drowned out the low murmur of the room. The single sheet of paper, the lease agreement, seemed to glow on the table, a beacon of her shame. She could smell the faint, acrid scent of the toner ink, the smell of freshly printed evidence. The air conditioning unit above her head hummed, a monotonous, indifferent sound that mocked the catastrophic drama unfolding below. She looked down at her hands, which were still clasped on the table, and noticed a tiny, almost invisible tremor running through her left index finger. It was the only part of her body that seemed to acknowledge the reality of the situation. The rest of her was numb, a shell of the confident, fiery revolutionary who had walked into the room 3 hours earlier. The lease. They paid my rent. They owned me. Not with a direct bribe, but with the subtle, insidious comfort of a luxury apartment. They knew my weakness. They knew I would never suspect a gift of convenience. They knew I was too busy fighting the giants to notice the termites eating the foundation of my own house. Her internal voice was now a low, mournful echo, a lament for a lost cause. I was so focused on the $93 trillion, I missed the $4,800 a month. The small betrayal is always the most effective. It's the one you never see coming, because it's cloaked in the guise of friendship and loyalty. She finally lifted her head, her eyes scanning the room. The faces of the committee members were a blur of judgment and pity. The reporters were a pack of wolves, their cameras still clicking, their pens still scratching, documenting the final moments of her public execution. She saw the face of Mrs. Clara Jenkins, the rancher, in her mind's eye, the look of profound disappointment. That look was worse than any political attack. It was the judgment of the people she had failed. She reached out a hand, her fingers brushing the edge of the microphone. The cold metal felt alien, unfamiliar. She had used this instrument for years to project her voice, her passion, her moral authority. Now it felt like a weapon pointed back at her. "Mr. Chairman," she began, her voice a dry, rasping sound that required a moment to clear. She took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing herself to speak with the clarity and conviction that was her trademark, even if the conviction was now hollow. I have no defense for the actions of my staff. The documents presented by Senator Kennedy, the Ethereum mandate, the debt for training scheme, the personal financial ties, they paint a picture of cynical, calculated corruption. A corruption that used the moral urgency of the climate crisis as a cover for a massive corporate wealth transfer. And I, as the author and chief proponent of this legislation, bear the ultimate responsibility for allowing that rot to take root. She paused, her eyes meeting the lens of the main C-SPAN camera, a final, desperate attempt to salvage a shred of honesty from the wreckage. I was so focused on the scale of the victory, the end of fossil fuels, the millions of jobs, that I became blind to the details. I trusted the process. I trusted my team. And in doing so, I betrayed the trust of the people who sent me here. I allowed the very forces I swore to fight to co-opt my vision, to turn a revolutionary idea into a corporate slush fund. She looked down at the lease agreement again, the shame of physical weight. The personal details, the rent, the payments, they are damning. They show that I was living a life of privilege, paid for by the very interests I was supposed to be fighting. I was a puppet, Mr. Chairman, a well-intentioned but ultimately compromised puppet. Her voice gained a sudden fierce intensity, a final flicker of the fire that had defined her career. But let me be clear, the corruption of the bill does not negate the truth of the crisis. The planet is still dying. The climate emergency is real. Senator Kennedy has successfully exposed the betrayal, but he has not refuted the science. He has simply shown that the forces of greed are so powerful, so insidious, that they can corrupt even the most well-meaning attempt to stop them. The fight is not over. The fight is just beginning. And now we know exactly who the enemy is and where they hide, not just in the boardrooms but in the inner circles of power, cloaked in the language of compromise. She pushed herself away from the table, her chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. It was a gesture of finality, a surrender and a renewed declaration of war all at once. I will be resigning my seat, effective immediately, to dedicate myself to exposing the full scope of this corruption. I will not allow my compromised position to be used as a shield for the traitors who profited from this bill. The Green New Deal must be rewritten, from the ground up, with absolute transparency. And the people who engineered this betrayal, the lobbyists, the corporate executives, and yes, the members of my own staff, must be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. She turned and walked out of the hearing room, her white suit a stark, solitary figure against the dark wood. She did not look back. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the sudden, stunned silence of the room. The revolutionary had fallen, but in her fall she had ignited a new, more dangerous fire. The fire of a martyr seeking redemption. Kennedy, watching from the side door of the chairman's office, allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible nod of respect. A clean kill, he thought. She chose the only path left to her, martyrdom. It's a powerful move. It turns the defeat into a moral victory. She's still fighting the narrative, even as she walks away. He knew his victory was complete but also temporary. He had won the battle, but the war for the soul of the Green New Deal, and the $93 trillion at stake was far from over. He had exposed the corruption, but he had also validated the crisis. The next phase would be the hardest, dismantling the bill without appearing to dismantle the planet. The silence of the hearing room was now the silence of a political vacuum, and nature, Kennedy knew, abhorred a vacuum. The game was on. The gavel finally fell again, a sharp, decisive sound that broke the spell. "The committee is adjourned," the chairman announced, his voice sounding weary, defeated by the sheer weight of the scandal. Kennedy walked back into the room, not to speak, but to observe the chaos he had wrought. The reporters were now interviewing the remaining committee members, their voices a desperate, overlapping chorus. His legislative director, Marcus Thorne, met him at the door, his face grim. "Senator, the fallout is catastrophic. Ethereum stock is halted. The SEC is launching an inquiry. The majority leader is demanding a meeting, and the White House is trying to distance itself from the entire Green New Deal, calling it a House-led initiative." Kennedy merely adjusted his tie, his movements slow and deliberate. The White House can call it whatever they like, Marcus. The fact remains that $93 trillion was on the table, and they were all reaching for a piece of it. This isn't just about the Congresswoman. This is about the entire political ecosystem that allowed this level of corruption to be cloaked in moral righteousness. The real enemy is the system itself, Kennedy mused, his internal thoughts a cold, strategic assessment. The system that allows lobbyists to write legislation, that allows money to flow through shell companies, that allows a young, idealistic politician to be used as a front for global corporate interests. I didn't just expose her, I exposed the machine, and the machine will now try to crush me for it. He walked over to the witness table where Ocasio-Cortez's microphone still stood, a silent monument to her fall. He picked up the single sheet of paper, the lease agreement, and folded it neatly, slipping it into his jacket pocket. This was not just evidence. It was a trophy, a reminder of the fragility of moral certainty in the face of absolute power. He looked at the empty space where Lena Reyes had been standing. Chen Reyes Consulting. They'll be the scapegoats. They'll take the fall. But the money trail goes higher. It always does. His mind was already moving, calculating the next move. The resignation was a distraction. The real work was just beginning. He needed to follow the money from Vanguard Strategies, Ethereum's lobbying firm, all the way to the top of the Senate leadership who had insisted on the Ethereum mandate. He turned to Thorne. Contact the FBI. Give them everything we have on Chen Reyes Consulting, the wire transfers, the contracts, the lease. Tell them we want a full, unredacted audit of Vanguard Strategies' client list and expenditures for the last 3 years. And tell them I want a special prosecutor appointed to investigate the legislative process of the Green New Deal. A special prosecutor, Senator. That's a declaration of war on the entire establishment, Thorne warned, his voice low. War is what we have, Marcus, Kennedy replied, his eyes hard. She called it criminal negligence. I call it treason against the taxpayer, and treason requires a reckoning. He walked out of the hearing room, his gait slow, measured, the picture of a man burdened by the truth. He knew the cameras were still on him, capturing his every move. He was no longer the folksy lawyer. He was the reluctant hero, the man who had dared to speak the truth in the face of overwhelming corruption. It was a role he played with practiced ease, a performance designed to solidify his position for the coming political storm. The people need a hero, he thought, as he stepped into the hallway, the flashbulbs of the waiting photographers blinding him for a moment. And I need to be that hero. Not for the party, not for the ideology, but for the sheer, brutal pleasure of watching the corrupt machine dismantle itself. He paused, turning to face the wall of cameras and microphones. He didn't speak about Ocasio-Cortez. He didn't speak about the bill. He spoke about the principle. Today, he said, his voice carrying the weight of history, we saw the consequence of a political class that believes its own moral superiority exempts it from accountability. We saw a multi-trillion-dollar piece of legislation designed not to save the planet, but to enrich a handful of global elites. The betrayal is not just of a political ideal. It is a betrayal of the American people. We will not stop until every single person involved in this cynical scheme, from the lobbyists who wrote the language to the politicians who signed off on the kickbacks, is brought to justice. The swamp, ladies and gentlemen, is deeper than we thought, but we have a shovel, and we are not afraid to dig. He turned and walked away, his words echoing in the marble hallway. The performance was complete. The political landscape had been irrevocably altered. The revolutionary was gone, and the avenger was now in charge. The $93 trillion question remained. Who would control the narrative and who would control the money? The silence of the aftermath was merely the prelude to the next, far more brutal act of the political drama. The betrayal had been exposed, but the war for power was just beginning. Ocasio-Cortez did not go to the press room. She did not go to her office. She walked out of the Dirksen building and into the humid, blinding sunlight of the Washington afternoon. She walked for hours, her white suit a magnet for the city's dust and grime, her mind a maelstrom of shame, anger, and a terrifying, cold clarity. Ignorance is not an excuse for betrayal. Mrs. Jenkins's words were a relentless hammer blow in her mind. She had always believed that her intentions were pure, that her vision was uncorrupted. She had built her entire political identity on the idea of being different, of being better than the cynical, compromised establishment. And yet, she had been played, used, and discarded by the very people she had brought into her inner circle. She found herself standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the massive, silent figure of the 16th president looking out over the reflecting pool. She sat down on the cold, hard marble, the weight of the city pressing down on her. Lincoln, he understood betrayal. He understood the cost of a divided house. But his betrayal was ideological. Mine was personal. Mine was venal. She pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over Lena Reyes's contact. She wanted to call, to scream, to demand an explanation, a justification. But she knew there was none. The wire transfers, the shell companies, the rent payments, they were the language of pure, unadulterated greed. Lena and David hadn't believed in the revolution. They had seen it as a business opportunity, a chance to get rich quick under the cover of moral righteousness. They had used her fame, her passion, her moral authority as a commodity. They saw the $93 trillion and they didn't see a plan to save the world. They saw a giant, slow-moving ATM, and they found the back door. She thought about the $4,800 a month apartment, the high ceilings, the view of the Navy Yard, the quiet luxury. She had always justified it as a necessity, a small comfort in a life of constant political warfare. I need a safe space. I need to be able to think. I need to be close to the Capitol. The justifications now sounded hollow, pathetic. She had been living a lie, a comfortable, well-appointed lie, paid for by the enemies of her cause. The internal monologue shifted from self-recrimination to a cold, burning resolve. Resignation is not the end. It is the beginning. I cannot fight the system from within because the system has proven it can corrupt me. I must fight it from the outside. I must become the witness, the prosecutor, the relentless voice of the betrayed. She realized Kennedy had given her a gift, a terrible, devastating gift, but a gift nonetheless. He had stripped away her illusions, exposed her vulnerabilities, and in doing so, had freed her from the constraints of the political machine. She was no longer a congresswoman, bound by rules, committees, and party loyalty. She was a private citizen, armed with the truth and a burning desire for vengeance. Kennedy, he is a master. He didn't just win, he orchestrated my surrender. He knew the only way to truly defeat me was to make me defeat myself. He is the ultimate cynic, a man who understands that power is not about ideology, but about leverage. He used my own moral code against me. She looked out over the reflecting pool, the setting sun casting long, dramatic shadows. She knew what she had to do. She had to follow the money, not just the $4 million that went to Chen Ray's consulting, but the billions that were about to flow to Ethereum Energy Solutions. She had to expose the Senate leaders who had insisted on the mandate. She had to turn her political death into a political resurrection. She pulled out her phone and sent a single encrypted message to a trusted investigative journalist she knew, a woman who had always been skeptical of the Green New Deal's financial underpinnings. The message was short, brutal, and to the point. I have the full paper trail on Ethereum. It goes to the top. I'm out. I'm ready to talk. Meet me tonight. Bring a lawyer and a secure line. The game was not over. It had merely moved to a darker, more dangerous playing field. The betrayal had been exposed, but the reckoning was yet to come. The silence of the night was the sound of a new war being declared. The meeting was set for a secure location in Georgetown, a small, nondescript brownstone owned by the journalist's publishing house, a place specifically designed to thwart surveillance. Ocasio-Cortez took a taxi, paying in cash, watching the city lights blur past the window. The white suit, now wrinkled and stained, felt like a costume from a play that had ended in tragedy. She was shedding her old identity, piece by piece, the physical discomfort a necessary penance for her political sins. The journalist, Sarah Vance, was waiting for her, along with a constitutional lawyer from a non-profit watchdog group. The room was sparse, lit by a single, harsh desk lamp. The air smelled of old paper and ozone from the electronic sweep they had just conducted. "Congresswoman," Sarah said, her voice low and professional, offering a hand. I'm sorry it had to come to this. Don't be sorry, Sarah, Ocasio-Cortez replied, her voice steady, devoid of emotion. Be ready. Kennedy only exposed the appetizer. The main course is still in the Senate. I need to give you everything, but I need your word. This is not about me. This is about the bill. This is about Ethereum. This is about the $93 trillion betrayal. She sat down at the table, pulling out a small, encrypted thumb drive she had managed to retrieve from her office before resigning. It contained her personal notes, her internal staff memos, and most importantly, the unredacted drafts of the Green New Deal, showing the exact moments the Ethereum language had been inserted. The key is the Senate, Ocasio-Cortez began, her voice a low, intense murmur. The Ethereum mandate was non-negotiable for Senator Mitch McConnell's vote, not the Republican McConnell but the centrist Democrat, Senator Eleanor McConnell of West Virginia. She was the swing vote. She insisted on the proprietary, closed-loop language. She claimed it was to protect West Virginia coal miners by retraining them for the new technology. But the truth is, her husband is on the board of Vanguard Strategies, Ethereum's lobbying firm. The lawyer, a sharp-featured man named David Stern, leaned forward, his pen poised over a legal pad. That's the connection. That's the quid pro quo. We can trace the Vanguard payments to her husband's foundation. That's a direct violation of Senate ethics rules and potentially federal law. Ocasio-Cortez nodded, the realization of the depth of the conspiracy chilling her to the bone. It goes deeper. The natural gas plant on Mrs. Jenkins's land. That was a separate deal. The land was seized through eminent domain, but the contract to build the gas plant was awarded to a company called Appalachian Energy Partners. Appalachian Energy Partners is a subsidiary of a holding company owned by Senator McConnell's brother-in-law. It was a two-pronged betrayal. The Ethereum mandate for the wife, the gas plant contract for the family. She pushed the thumb drive across the table. The files are all there. The internal emails, the meeting notes, the drafts with the track changes. I want you to publish it all, not in a slow, measured way. I want a detonation. I want the entire Senate to feel the heat. I want the $93 trillion bill to be dead on arrival, not because of the cost, but because of the corruption. Sarah Vance looked at the thumb drive, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. This is the story of the decade, Congresswoman. You're not just exposing a scandal, you're exposing the entire mechanism of legislative capture. Ocasio-Cortez leaned back, the exhaustion finally hitting her. She closed her eyes, the image of Kennedy's cold, triumphant smile flashing in her mind. He had won the battle, but she was about to hand the ultimate weapon to his enemies. The political drama was about to become a constitutional crisis. The betrayal was complete, but the reckoning was about to consume the entire political establishment. The silence in the secure room was the quiet before the storm. The silence in the secure room was not peaceful. It was a pressurized, humming void, filled with the unspoken weight of the documents on the table. The single desk lamp cast long, distorted shadows, making the three figures look like conspirators in a historical painting. Ocasio-Cortez opened her eyes, the harsh light stinging them. She could hear the faint, rhythmic tick of a clock somewhere in the hallway, marking the passage of time toward the inevitable explosion. She watched as Sarah Vance, the journalist, plugged the thumb drive into a dedicated, air-gapped laptop. The whir of the fan was loud in the quiet room. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating the labyrinthine file structure Ocasio-Cortez had created. The journalist's face, illuminated by the screen's glow, was a study in focused intensity, the kind of professional detachment that could handle the truth without flinching. The key is the timing, Ocasio-Cortez murmured, her voice hoarse. She reached for the glass of water on the table, her hand steady now. Kennedy's attack was surgical. Our response must be a carpet bomb. We need to release the full Senate connection, McConnell, Vanguard, the gas plant. At the exact moment the press is focused on my resignation. We turn the story from AOC's corruption to AOC's sacrifice exposes Senate corruption. David Stern, the lawyer, finally spoke, his voice dry and precise. The legal risk is immense, Congresswoman. You are essentially admitting to a failure of due diligence while simultaneously accusing a sitting senator of criminal conspiracy. They will come after you with everything they have: libel, ethics charges, possibly even obstruction of justice for withholding this information until now. Let them, Ocasio-Cortez said, a cold, hard smile touching her lips. I have nothing left to lose. My career is over. My reputation is in tatters, but my truth is intact. I will be the martyr who brings down the temple. The public will forgive the puppet who exposes the puppeteers. She leaned forward, her elbows on the table, her gaze fixed on the lawyer. The narrative must be absolute. I was betrayed by my staff, who were in turn controlled by Senator McConnell's family interests. The Green New Deal was a Trojan horse, designed to fail the planet while enriching a few. I am now dedicating my life to ensuring that the $93 trillion is never spent, and that the people who engineered this betrayal face justice. That is the only story. That is the only redemption. Sarah Vance looked up from the laptop, her eyes wide. The sheer volume of evidence is overwhelming. The emails from Lena raised to Senator McConnell's chief of staff, detailing the technical language on page 1487. It's all here. It's a smoking gun, Congresswoman. A nuclear smoking gun. Ocasio-Cortez felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The shame was still there, a dull ache, but it was now overshadowed by the clarity of her purpose. She had been a revolutionary who had failed to understand the true nature of power. Now, she was a warrior who understood that the only way to win was to destroy the battlefield. The betrayal had been her crucible. "We launch at dawn," she commanded, her voice firm. "I want the full report on the front page of every major paper. I want the flow chart of the money trail, Vanguard to McConnell's husband to Appalachian Energy Partners, to be the visual centerpiece. And I want a single powerful quote from Mrs. Clara Jenkins, the rancher, about the gas plant on her land. We make this personal. We make it human. We make it undeniable." She stood up, her mission clear. The white suit was a symbol of her past failure. Her future was defined by the cold, hard evidence on the thumb drive. The silence of the secure room was broken only by the frantic typing of the journalist, preparing the final, devastating blow. The political drama was about to reach its climax, a reckoning that would shake the foundations of the American Senate. The betrayal was exposed, and the avenger was ready.